I never thought a simple piece of paper could destroy everything I believed about my family. But there it was, tucked inside the breast pocket of my mother's old navy jacket, yellowed with age and folded so many times the creases had worn thin. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the words impossible to comprehend at first. My darling Eleanor, I will love you and our daughter until my last breath. Please tell her about me when she's ready. James. Our daughter. Not my father's daughter. Our daughter. I stood there in my mother's closet, surrounded by the scent of her favorite lavender perfume still clinging to her clothes, and felt my entire world crumble. My mother had been gone for 3 months, and here I was, a 62-year-old woman discovering that everything I'd been told about my birth was a lie. My hands trembled as I read the note again, hoping somehow the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense within the family story I'd always known. But they didn't. James. Not Robert, my father who'd raised me with such devotion for 47 years before his death. James, a complete stranger whose name had never once been spoken in our household. I sank onto my mother's bed, still holding that damning piece of paper, and tried to process what this meant. Had my entire life been built on a foundation of deception? Growing up, I'd been the apple of my father Robert's eye. He'd called me his little princess and never missed a single school play, graduation, or important milestone. When people said I looked nothing like him, he'd laugh and say I was the spitting image of my mother's side of the family. Now, sitting in the suffocating silence of my mother's bedroom, those innocent comments took on an entirely different meaning. Had he known? Had he been complicit in this lie, or had he been deceived too? The weight of responsibility had always rested heavily on my shoulders. As the eldest of 3 children, I'd been the one to coordinate my mother's care during her final illness, to handle her funeral arrangements, and now to clean out her house before putting it on the market. My younger brothers, Michael and David, had been grateful to let me take charge, trusting that I knew best how to honor our mother's memory. They called me the family historian, the one who kept track of everyone's birthdays and anniversaries, who organized the holiday gatherings and maintained the family photo albums. How was I supposed to tell them that our family history was apparently fiction? I spent the rest of that afternoon going through every drawer, every box, every corner of my mother's room, searching for more evidence of this James person. My mother, Eleanor, had been meticulous about keeping records. She had boxes of letters from friends, recipes clipped from magazines, programs from church services dating back decades. But there was nothing else about James. It was as if that single note was the only proof he'd ever existed. That evening I called my eldest daughter, Sarah, needing someone to talk through this impossible situation. At 38, Sarah had always been my confidant, the one who inherited my need to understand and organize everything around me. But when I tried to explain what I'd found, the words stuck in my throat. How do you tell your child that their grandmother was keeping secrets that could rewrite the family tree? How do you admit that you might not be who you've always believed yourself to be? Mom, you're scaring me, Sarah said when I finally managed to tell her about the note. Are you sure you read it correctly? Maybe it's just an old love letter from Grandpa Robert that you misunderstood. But I knew what I'd read. The handwriting was completely different from my father's careful script that I knew so well from birthday cards and letters he'd written during his business trips. This was someone else's hand, someone else's words, someone else's love. The next morning I drove to my brother Michael's house, the note burning like a guilty secret in my purse. Michael was 5 years younger than me, a successful accountant who'd inherited our father's practical nature and attention to detail. If anyone could help me think through this logically, it would be him. I found him in his home office, surrounded by the tax documents and financial reports that had made him the family's unofficial treasurer since Dad's death. Jane, what brings you by so early? He asked, looking up from his computer with a smile that reminded me so much of our father that my heart ached. Did he have the right to keep smiling like that, so innocent and unaware that our family might be held together by lies? I pulled the note from my purse and placed it on his desk without a word. Watched as his expression changed from curiosity to confusion to something approaching fear as he read those devastating words. My darling Eleanor, I will love you and our daughter until my last breath. Where did you find this? His voice was barely above a whisper. Mom's closet. In her navy jacket pocket. I sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk. Michael, what if Dad wasn't my biological father? What if everything we've believed about our family is wrong? He read the note again, then set it down carefully, as if it might explode. This doesn't make sense. Mom and Dad were married for 53 years. They were devoted to each other. There's no way she would have had an affair. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. We both knew that our parents had married young, just 18 and 19 years old, after a whirlwind courtship that lasted only 3 months. They'd always told us it was love at first sight, but what if there had been more urgent reasons for their hasty wedding? I need to know who James is, I said. I need to understand what this means. Michael nodded slowly. Have you told David yet? David, our youngest brother, was only 49 and had always been the baby of the family, protected and sheltered by the rest of us. The thought of shattering his innocent faith in our family's story made my stomach turn. Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. That afternoon we drove together to David's house, where we found him working in his garden, his hands covered in soil as he planted bulbs for the spring. David had always been the gentle one among us, the artist who'd chosen to teach high school art rather than pursue a more lucrative career. He looked up at us with immediate concern when he saw our serious expressions. What's wrong? Is everyone okay? I showed him the note, watched as the color drained from his face. Unlike Michael's analytical response, David's reaction was purely emotional. Tears filled his eyes as he read those words that had turned our world upside down. This can't be real, he whispered. Mom wouldn't have kept something like this from us. She wouldn't have lied to us our whole lives. But the evidence was there, written in fading ink on paper that felt as fragile as our faith in everything we'd believed to be true. We sat in David's kitchen, the three of us united in our confusion and grief, trying to figure out what to do next. We need to research this James person, I said finally. We need to find out who he was and what his relationship with Mom really was. Michael, ever practical, was already making lists. We'll need to check birth certificates, marriage records, maybe hire a private investigator. This is going to require serious detective work. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the investigation with an intensity that worried my family. I spent hours at the county courthouse, poring over marriage licenses and birth certificates. I hired a genealogist to help trace our mother's history. I contacted elderly neighbors who might remember details from the early years of my parents' marriage. The first breakthrough came when I found my own original birth certificate, which I'd never actually seen before. The one I'd used for passports and official documents was apparently a copy, but the original was stored in my mother's safety deposit box. When I finally held it in my hands, my worst fears were confirmed. Under Father's name, someone had written Robert Patterson in different ink, clearly added later. The original entry had been whited out, but I could just make out the faint impression of different letters underneath. My daughter Sarah accompanied me to the safety deposit box that day, and she was the first to notice something I'd missed. "Mom, look at the dates," she said, pointing to the marriage certificate we'd also found. Grandma and Grandpa Robert were married on June 15, 1962. But you were born on March 3, 1963. That's only 8.5 months later. The math was undeniable. Either I'd been born significantly premature, which no one had ever mentioned, or I'd been conceived before my mother married Robert. The timeline that had never quite added up suddenly made perfect sense in the worst possible way. That evening, I called my brothers to share what we'd discovered. Michael's response was characteristic of his methodical nature. We need more evidence before we jump to conclusions. One note and some questionable timing aren't enough to rewrite family history. But David was devastated. How could she lie to us for so long? How could she let Dad raise another man's child without telling him the truth? We don't know that Dad didn't know, I pointed out, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Maybe they both decided to keep it secret to protect me. The genealogist I'd hired, a thorough woman named Margaret Chun, called me the following week with information that made everything even more complicated. She'd found records of a James Morrison who'd lived in our town during the early 1960s, a man who'd worked as a mechanic at the garage where my mother had taken her car for repairs. He'd left town abruptly in early 1963, around the time I was born, and had died in a car accident in California just 2 years later. If this is the James from the note, Margaret explained during our meeting, then he never had the chance to be part of your life, even if he'd wanted to be. He was only 24 when he died. 24. Younger than my own children were now. I tried to imagine this young man, working with his hands, falling in love with my 18-year-old mother, then being forced to disappear from her life before they could figure out a way to be together. The tragedy of it overwhelmed me. But Margaret had found something else, something that made the situation even more complex. Your mother married Robert Patterson very quickly after James left town. From what I can tell, they'd known each other since childhood, but had never dated seriously. It seems like Robert may have stepped in to help her when she found herself alone and pregnant. The idea of my father as a young man, barely 19 himself, choosing to marry my mother and claim me as his own child, filled me with a confusing mixture of gratitude and grief. If this version of events was true, then Robert Patterson had been even more of a hero than I'd ever known. He'd saved my mother's reputation and given me a name and a stable home, asking for nothing in return except the chance to be my father in every way that mattered. I spent sleepless nights trying to reconcile this new understanding of my parents' marriage with the loving, devoted relationship I'd witnessed throughout my childhood. Had it started as a marriage of convenience that grew into genuine love? Had my father ever regretted his decision to raise another man's child? Had my mother ever stopped loving this James person who died so young? The questions multiplied as I dug deeper into the mystery. I tracked down elderly relatives who might remember the early days of my parents' marriage, but their memories were either too faded or too diplomatic to provide clear answers. My mother's sister, my Aunt Ruth, was still alive at 86, but when I called her in the nursing home where she lived, she claimed to know nothing about any James. Your mother was always very private about her personal business, Aunt Ruth said carefully. She married Robert, and they were happy together. That's all that matters now, don't you think? But I could hear something in her voice, a carefully controlled tone that suggested she knew more than she was willing to share. When I pressed her gently, she finally admitted, "There were rumors, of course. Your mother was so young when she married and you came along so quickly. But Robert loved you from the moment you were born. He never treated you as anything but his precious daughter." The conversation with Aunt Ruth left me more confused than ever. Part of me wanted to drop the entire investigation, to accept that some family secrets were meant to stay buried. My mother was gone, my father was gone, and this James person had been dead for decades. What purpose would it serve to unearth the truth now? But I couldn't let it go. The note had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and I needed to walk through it completely. I owed it to myself, to my children, and somehow I felt I owed it to James Morrison, the young man whose love for my mother had been preserved in that faded piece of paper. My research led me to California, where James had died. Through online records and the help of a local genealogist, I discovered that he'd been killed in a single-car accident on a rainy night in 1965. The newspaper report was brief, describing him as a transient worker, with no known family in the area. But I also found something else. A storage unit that had been rented in his name and never claimed after his death. The facility was still in operation, though under different ownership. When I called and explained my situation, the current manager, a kind woman named Patricia, told me that they had several unclaimed units from decades past. "We keep them because we never know when someone might come looking for family history. Let me check our records for James Morrison." It took 3 weeks for them to locate the right unit and get legal clearance for me to examine its contents. I flew to California with my daughter Sarah, both of us nervous about what we might find. When Patricia opened the metal door and we peered inside, I saw a few pieces of furniture, some boxes of clothes, and a small trunk that looked like it might contain personal items. Inside the trunk, I found a treasure trove of evidence that confirmed everything I'd suspected, and much more that I'd never imagined. There were dozens of letters from my mother, written in the months before my birth. Letters full of love and longing, describing her pregnancy and her fears about the future. Letters that painted a picture of two young people desperately in love, but trapped by circumstances beyond their control. In one letter, dated February 1963, my mother had written, "James, my darling, I can feel our baby moving now. She's going to be strong and beautiful, just like her father. I know we can't be together the way we want to be, But please know that I will love you both until my dying day. If something happens to me, please find a way to tell her that she was conceived in love, even if she was born into an impossible situation." Reading my mother's words, written when she was barely 19 and facing an uncertain future, brought tears to my eyes. The young woman who'd written these letters was so different from the composed, secretive mother I'd known. She'd been vulnerable and scared, but so clearly in love with this man who'd been forced to leave her behind. There were also letters from James to my mother, filled with anguish about leaving her and promises to return when he'd saved enough money to support a family. In one letter he'd written, "Eleanor, I dream about holding our daughter and teaching her to ride a bicycle and walking her down the aisle someday. I know that might never happen, but I want you to know that she'll never be far from my thoughts. If Robert is willing to give her his name and his love, then I have to be grateful for that, even though it breaks my heart to let another man raise my child." So Robert had known the truth from the beginning. The letters made it clear that all three of them, my mother, my father, and James, had been part of the decision about my future. James had agreed to step aside for my benefit, and Robert had agreed to step forward, not just to help my mother, but to give me the stable home that James couldn't provide at 19 with no family support and limited financial prospects. The final item in the trunk was a small wooden jewelry box that contained a ring. Not an engagement ring, but a simple silver band with a small engraving on the inside. "For our daughter, with all my love. J." There was also a letter addressed to me, sealed but never sent. My hand shook as I opened the envelope and read the words that James had written to a daughter he'd never had the chance to meet. "My dear daughter, if you're reading this, then somehow the truth has found its way to you. I want you to know that you were wanted and loved from the moment I learned you existed. Your mother is the most wonderful woman I've ever known, and I know she'll raise you to be strong and kind and beautiful. I hope the man who gives you his name will love you as much as I do, even from a distance. I hope you'll have a good life, full of all the happiness that your mother and I couldn't find together. You are my greatest joy and my deepest regret, and I will carry you in my heart until the day I die. Your father." James, Sarah, and I both cried as we sat in that dusty storage unit, surrounded by the remnants of a love story that had been hidden for 60 years. The man I'd never known had thought about me, had loved me, had wanted to be part of my life, but had chosen my happiness over his own desires. When we returned home, I gathered my brothers and my children to share everything I'd discovered. The letters, the ring, the full story of how Robert Patterson had stepped in to save my mother's reputation and give me his name and his love. Far from diminishing my father's role in my life, the truth made his sacrifice even more heroic. Dad knew from the beginning that I wasn't his biological child, I explained to my family, but he chose to love me anyway. He chose to be my father in every way that mattered. And James chose to let him, because he knew Robert could give me things that he couldn't. My brother David, who'd been struggling the most with the revelation, finally found peace with the story. "So we had two fathers," he said quietly. "One who gave you life, and one who gave you everything else." The discovery changed how I understood my family history, but it didn't change the love we'd shared or the memories we'd built together. If anything, it made me appreciate even more the man who'd raised me with such devotion, never once making me feel like anything less than his beloved daughter. I decided to have James Morrison's name added to my father's headstone, with a simple inscription, "James Morrison, 1938 to 1965, beloved father." It seemed like the right way to honor both men who'd shaped my life, even though I'd only known one of them. The ring that James had left for me became a treasured possession, something I wore on my right hand to remind me that love takes many forms. The love of a young man who'd sacrificed his own happiness for his daughter's future. The love of another young man who'd stepped forward to provide that future. And the love of a woman who'd carried the secret of both loves for 60 years, protecting everyone involved until the day she died. Sometimes I wondered if my mother had left that note in her jacket pocket on purpose, knowing I'd find it when I cleaned out her closet. She'd always been incredibly organized, and it seemed unlike her to leave such an important document in such a casual place. Maybe, at the end of her life, she'd finally been ready for the truth to come out. Maybe she'd wanted me to understand the full story of how I'd come to be loved by so many people. The revelation brought our family closer together, if anything. My children were fascinated by the story of their grandmother's first love, and their grandfather's generous heart. My brothers and I found ourselves talking more openly about our parents, sharing memories and impressions that we'd never discussed before. The secret that might have torn us apart instead became a new foundation for understanding the strength and complexity of family love. I kept all of James's letters and shared copies with my children and grandchildren. His words became part of our family history, not as a source of shame or confusion, but as evidence of the many different ways that people can love and sacrifice for each other. My youngest granddaughter, who was 8 when I told her the story, said it best. Great-grandma must have been really special for 2 men to love her so much that they put your happiness first. The note I'd found in my mother's closet had indeed changed everything we believed about our family. But instead of destroying our foundation, it had revealed just how strong that foundation really was. Built not on perfect circumstances or simple love stories, but on the complicated, beautiful, sometimes painful reality of people doing their best to take care of each other, even when it cost them everything they thought they wanted. I still have that original note, carefully preserved now in a frame on my mantel. Next to it is a photo of my father Robert, holding me as a newborn, with a look of pure joy on his 19-year-old face. And beside that is the only photo I have of James Morrison, found among his belongings in that storage unit. A young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, the face of someone I should have known but somehow always carried in my heart. The truth didn't change the love I'd been given. It just helped me understand how much more love there had been than I'd ever known.